Welcome to episode 153. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. Today's episode is an Ask Me Anything featuring questions submitted by members of the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group on Facebook. We're doing a new AMA episode every few months, so if you want to join the conversation and be able to contribute your questions, be sure to head over and join the group. There are lots of great people and conversations over there, and we would love to have you. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Our first question comes from Jenny. She shared about one of her 8-year-old twins who's going through an evaluation process next month to find out if he is on the autism spectrum or if it's just some of the interplay of all of the other issues that he has. It sounds like she's getting some pushback from some folks about the process, and she writes that she tells people, "I'm not looking for a label, I'm looking for help. If getting the label of autism will help him get the support he needs, I'm all for it." So first of all, Jenny, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think that looking for an identification to help understand your child better is always going to be beneficial. And I think that probably some of the reasons that people are pushing back against that all come from the stigma and the hesitation that people have about giving a diagnosis to somebody and labeling somebody. There's so much stigma surrounding neurodiversity and autism that they feel uncomfortable with it. And it's easier to explain it away and say, oh, well, they're just kind of quirky or they're just kind of different or, whatever. And somehow that feels safer to people. But as you know, I am a huge advocate for destigmatizing labels, especially as they relate to neurodiversity. And the more that we can normalize this and recognize that there's nothing wrong with with being neurodivergent, the better it is. In addition to accessing additional services for your child, the other benefit to them is that when they have a label, it will help them have a greater sense of self-understanding, and that can be really valuable. I participate in a consultation group for clinicians, and we frequently talk about what is the benefit of giving somebody a label. And we recognize that there is utility in labels, but they're also inaccurate. And we are doing the best that we can to give children and adults an accurate identification or label. Bottom line, don't worry about what everyone else is saying. You do what you feel is best for your child. Jeremy writes this. I'm wondering where you see the greatest demand for more learning on neurodiversity among the support community. Is it special ed and regular ed teachers, pediatricians, OTs, psychologists, psychiatrists, and this is a direct quote from Jeremy, who already think they know everything about everything? So, all of the above? No, I think the bottom line is you can find pockets of understanding in various professions, especially depending on their specialization. And that's my experience. There are specialists who are more likely to understand neurodiversity. So, for example, OTs who work with young kids working on sensory needs versus occupational therapists who work with adults in rehabilitation. Well, obviously, those OTs who work with the young kids are probably going to have more experience and understanding with neurodiversity. I feel like special education teachers and gifted education teachers a lot of times have a greater understanding because they work with some of those neurodivergent kids a little bit more than perhaps the general education teachers who are more focused on the curriculum and the students that they have in their classroom. But I think the good thing about all of this is that more people are beginning to understand the concept of neurodiversity, although progress is very slow. I know that the medical community really needs a lot of support to help depathologize a lot of these diagnoses. So often in the medical community, we use diagnostics as a way to fix a problem. And so it takes a real reframe to recognize that, yes, there might be things that need support for neurodivergent people, but also it's not something that needs to be quote unquote fixed or gotten rid of. The most important aspect of finding a professional who is neurodiversity affirming, though, is that you can find someone who is willing to learn. If you can find a therapist or a teacher who is willing to check out info in a book or a website or a podcast, they can learn how to be neurodiversity affirming. I think it's important to recognize that just because somebody doesn't already have a lot of that experience doesn't mean that they can't have that experience. I mean, a decade ago, or even really 5 or 6 years ago, I had not even heard the term neurodiversity. And I think that that's kind of true for many of us. We are really in the process of growing and learning. And so we really want to embrace that. So just finding the people who are willing to listen and who are willing to learn is the most important piece. So Scott asks, how do I set reasonable expectations for myself or my kids compared to when it is, quote unquote, enough? What are some internal or external indicators that current expectations are constructive, or when do they become damaging? Reasonableness is such a relative concept that I find myself questioning it frequently and not having a good answer. I think this is actually a really important question and something to recognize for parents. What is reasonable as far as expectations go is a moving bar. There are varying levels of energy and tolerance throughout the day, stress and fatigue and health. And that's not only true for our kids, it's true for us too. So what works on one day or what is reasonable on one day may not work or be reasonable on another. I think one of the first places to start with this is really to recognize yourself. How do you know for yourself when you are doing well and when you can push yourself a little bit more or when you need to step back a little bit? And I think that that might help give you a gauge for how you can identify that within your kids. Here are a few things to consider when you're trying to figure out when to push and when to let up. So first of all, look at your own dysregulation. If you are feeling really dysregulated, that probably means that your view on what you're pushing your kids to do or not might be a little bit skewed. And it's okay in those moments to take a step back and recalibrate and maybe even let things go for that moment. Also, if you notice that your child has been consistently making progress in an area, and then all of a sudden that becomes stagnant or they even begin to regress, that might be another sign that we need to let up on some of those expectations for them. And then a third piece to look for with your kids is just disengagement. If they have consistently been engaged and talking and interactive with things, and then all of a sudden they're not, again, that might be a sign that we need to either take a short or maybe even a longer break. Again, just permission that it is okay to sometimes just let things be. We don't have to have all of the solutions. Learning is a process for our kids, and everything is variable. One of the many statements that my mom has made that I always hang on to, that I feel like is really relevant about raising kids, is that the only thing that stays the same is that everything's going to change. And so you have to really be flexible about what our expectations are and how we're adjusting to those things based on their development, environmental factors, and anything else that might be influencing that. I don't know how much that answers your question because you're asking about what is quote unquote reasonable. And I think the hardest part about that is it is flexible. It doesn't always have a really consistent answer with that. But I guess my point is that it's okay to give yourself that grace to move that around as needed. This one's from Jennifer. Art teachers often serve every kid in our buildings, especially at the elementary level. In what ways can art teachers specifically meet the needs of our neurodiverse kiddos, especially those who might have tactile sensitivities? So I think this is a really great question because, first of all, a lot of our neurodivergent kids are highly artistic. One of the struggles for a lot of neurodivergent kids is that they are visual spatial thinkers and processors, which is really difficult for them when they are in a school setting, which is very much a language-based setting. This is not uncommon that art might be an area where they really can excel and feel confident. However, the sensory experiences in art, like the smells of paint or the textures of clay or pastels on their fingers, can really be very overwhelming for them. So the more we can give them some strategies and some tools to help handle that, the better. So one idea might be to develop a system for checking in, like a rating scale on their tolerance for that day. How much do they feel like they can be a risk taker or not? Or how are they enjoying or struggling with a specific activity? And once you have that system in place, that can become a common language that you can then use on a consistent basis. This can also help you determine when you need to either make accommodations or give them a break, and it also really helps them to build the skill of self-advocacy. Of course, having tools for accommodations, for example, plastic gloves to protect their hands, can also be a great way to help kids engage in the activities without triggering some of those sensory sensitivities. Having a variety of alternative assignments or options is always good as well. And one other thing that's kind of nice, and I know this isn't always the case, but a lot of times art teachers stay with students year after year. So if an art teacher has the opportunity to learn what works and what doesn't with a particular student, in addition to helping to build that trust, it can then help them eventually learn to take some risks or be willing to tolerate some discomfort in order to try some new things. Our next question is from somebody who submitted it anonymously. They write, I have 2 kids and they both have multiple labels, although they're different from each other. If we had been in a different district, it may have played out differently. Ours is smaller, Title I, and more rural. But looking back, I think all of my advocating probably made things worse 80 to 90% of the time. There are no consistent services in any of the districts they've attended. I think districts never want to say we can't or don't offer that because frequently their mission statements say they meet the needs of all kids. It's normal that schools don't love being questioned. The kids had years where the teacher-parent-child relationship was magical, and some years were a nightmare. I'm sure I've made mistakes, and I think part of it was just that the schools offer what they offer. I felt like I spent so much time advocating and volunteering and researching. I don't regret the research because we did apply a lot of it at home, and some teachers did use some of our suggested accommodations. First of all, I really empathize with the frustrations that this person is experiencing. It's really difficult to advocate for kids and even to know if what you're advocating for is the best thing. A lot of it is trial and error, and kids aren't always the best at knowing what they need, so they don't always verbalize that very well, especially as they're younger. But let me also just say that I sincerely doubt that the advocating made things worse. It probably added to your stress level a lot, but I can't imagine that it actively made things worse. Perhaps it didn't have the results you wanted. I find that a lot of times I have families who reach out to me and they are looking for information and support to advocate in the schools. I think one of the benefits that I have having worked in the schools, both as a teacher and as a school counselor, is that I realize what is realistic and what isn't in the school setting. I recognize that there are some accommodations that simply aren't really realistic in how they might play out. It might seem ideal, but it can be difficult to bridge that gap between what the schools are able to provide and what the parents would like to request. I think the key in all of this, though, is the relationship with the teacher, and you mentioned that in your letter. So one example of how important that relationship with a teacher is, I can remember a student who was a high school student, autistic, ADHD, and gifted. And one year in science, it was their least favorite subject. And they failed it and had to go to summer school and just really believed that they were terrible at science. The next year, science was their favorite subject and they got A's in it all year long. What was the difference? Well, the difference was their personality fit and what the expectations were and how they felt in that classroom. I think neurodivergent kids are especially dependent on having that support and relationship and feeling safe in an environment, because I think probably for a lot of their educational career, they have not felt safe. It's really hard to find that balance, and I would never encourage a parent to give up on advocating for their child. And I recognize the stress and the pressure that it puts on a parent to feel like they're in an adversarial relationship with the school. But ultimately, the more you keep that line of communication open and the more that you kind of follow up on what's working and what's not, the better it will be for your child. Additionally, they're actually also watching you and learning how they can self-advocate. The last question that we have actually came from a couple of different people in various forms. And realistically, it was asking about virtual schooling, What are the positives of virtual schools, and how can you find a good one? So I think it's interesting. I know that the pandemic really offered an opportunity for a lot of people to dip their toe into virtual schooling where perhaps they may not have in the past. And I know of multiple families who, once they had that experience, realized that that was actually a really great opportunity for their learner. It offers a variety of benefits, from just having more flexibility as far as where they're working or when they're working. You have a lot more flexibility as far as finding the just right academic level. If you need to bump up a specific subject and get something more challenging, you can do that. Or if you need to remediate something, you can do that too. It also eliminates some of the challenges that might come along with the social struggles of being in in-person school. For example, I can think of one particular student whose primary difficulty at school was with the peers and the teachers that were there. And moving to online schooling ultimately reduced their stress quite a bit, and they were able to still find opportunities for them to connect with other kids in other ways without having it in that pressurized situation in the academic setting. When you are looking for virtual schools, there are a lot of things that you can consider. Considering scheduling and what types of supports they provide, what types of accommodations are available, how flexible are they with neurodivergent kids. These are all considerations that if you're looking for a virtual schooling opportunity, you can consider. A lot of these virtual school options are very accessible even for parents to get information about them, and that can be really nice as well. One of the things that we know about neurodivergent kids is that they learn and think differently. And so sometimes that requires us to consider different options that we might not have considered in the past. So that's about all the time that we have for today. If you would like to participate and suggest your questions, be sure to head on over to Facebook and join the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group. I will see you there. Thanks for listening. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
This is a production of the Neurodiversity Alliance.